Items was ein tief auf ihr geht die Lasse. Items was ein tief auf ihr geht die Lasse. Open up your lips and my mouth shall declare your praise. Open up my lips and my mouth shall declare your praise. Sea to shining sea, oh, eh, eh. Searching for me, yeah. Searching for me, but you won't find me. All across the land, oh, yeah. We've been digging up some sand, yeah. Oh, we've been digging up some sand. With us up in skin with empty wind. Dispatch the troops and out the captain. My jam is held captive in the dungeon. Don't come back again till you end the mission. If it takes a long time, don't lose the vision. If you're stuck, check the blueprints and look within reflection. Gotta find a rhythm. Won't you please return, child? Where you sea to shining sea, yeah. Searching for me, yeah. Searching for me, but you won't find me. All across the land, oh, oh. I've been digging up some sand, yeah. I've been digging up the sand. In my night, twilight, moonlight and light in my night, at twilight. Get a bang, 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 get a bang. Place like a warrior slain, engraved into the space with his sword still raised. Layers of charcoal sprayed through hallways, praise relays off the walls echoing always. Dirt covered, dirt lays beneath my rib cage, give birth to overgrowth invading on the pathways. Dirt covered, dirt lays beneath my rib cage, giving birth to overgrowth invading on the pathways. Burn out trees, cover streets, children once played. So see decay through the sacred stepping stones in disarray. But the altar used to be placed, and it changed for blood stains. Sun rays illuminate the smoke-filled haze. Trace of incense and a sacrifice day.
Good evening, everybody. I hope we've all had wonderful days. Everyone out there in the interwebs. um, for those of you who don't know me, I am John Proper. I've been on and off behind the scenes at OneShul for a few years. Fell into OneShul in college while I was converting to Judaism, and actually helped put together the Shacharit, the morning service for OneShul. Oh gosh, a few years ago, back when I think the most recent Siddur was put together. So if you've ever davened with the morning service, then you've seen some of the stuff that I put together. Um, anyway, welcome to everybody for coming in tonight. I'm sure we'll probably have a few other people streaming in as the evening goes along. What I'd like to do before we get started is make sure that everyone can see and hear me okay. And the way you can tell me, for those of you who've been to OneShul, you'll know what I'm about to say. The way you can tell me if you're hearing me okay is by clicking on the bottom right hand of the screen. There's an orange button that says OneShul chat room. Click join the chat room and get in on the conversation that we're going to have tonight. I'll give everyone a couple seconds to get logged in, and just let me know if you can see and hear me okay. While everyone is doing that, I want to share the link to you of the PDF that I'll be using both tonight and tomorrow. Thanks, Ariella and Lanny. The link that I've just shared is the good. Everyone seems to perfect. So there's a bit of a delay, about 10 to 15 seconds on my end, or rather from when I start to broadcast and when you can hear it. So I apologize in advance if you want to respond to something and I accidentally move on to something else. Feel free to interject at any point and I'll answer your question. So before we get started tonight, there are several points of business to take care of. Just a couple things to talk about and to kind of set up what this program is all about. But first, what I'd like to do is ask each of you if you could answer the following question for me in the chat room space. Tonight's presentation is about Jewish thinkers, Jewish philosophers wrestling with the problems and the questions that the Holocaust raises for us. So what I would like to hear from you is, what do you know about philosophy? And it's okay if the answer that you're going for or the answer that you have to offer is, I don't know anything about philosophy. That's wonderful. We're glad that you're here to join us and that you're here to learn alongside of us. But yeah, just share a little bit about what your philosophy background might be, how much you know, did you study it in school, have you read a book, or are you sort of coming in blind? This class is open to everybody. So while you're doing that, what I'm going to do is go over a few basic points of business that we at OneShul like to cover every week. Anytime we're doing a class, we like to remind you sort of what we're all about and how you can help out. So first of all, what is OneShul? OneShul is one of the world's premier online synagogues. We are an entirely non-denominational or post-denominational or multi-denominational, however you want to sort of look at it. We are that. We are a synagogue for Jews who describe themselves as Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, none of the above. If you're a conservadox or Reformastructionist, then this is the place for you. We're really open to any and everyone. And this community is run in part by by folks like me. I'm not a rabbi, I'm not a scholar, I'm just a guy who's passionate about Judaism and want to learn alongside and study alongside other Jews. So we're a synagogue, we're also kind of a learning hall, all online. It's entirely free to be a member, and as a result of that, we entirely rely on donations from anyone who is willing and ready or able to donate, about the price of a cup of coffee to help us keep streaming OneShul so that it's free to anybody who wants to come in. So no pressure, but it's always good to mention that you are in part responsible for keeping us going. So I covered the broadcast delay. Covered donations, covered what is OneShul. One of the disclaimers that I want to start off with before we go any further is to say that tonight, because we're dealing with the subject of philosophy, like religion, it's a subject that's very contentious. So obviously, not that I think this will be a problem for anyone, but respectful dialogue in the chat room, please. And also, I will try my best to, I don't want to say warn you, but let you know in advance if what I'm about to say has more to do with my personal interpretation of a philosopher's ideas rather than sort of objectively, if that's even possible, an objective reading of their writing, of their essays, of their texts. Because I don't want to color your experience of the philosophers too much, because if you encounter them, you might find something completely different. So just as a disclaimer, so that I will try to let you know when I'm interpreting something and when I'm quoting something directly or what the consensus tends to be. So yeah, so let's look at some of the responses. I'm glad to hear everybody can hear me okay. A couple people, multi-philosophical, some saying knowing about different philosophers, the ancient Greeks, modern thinkers who have things to say about the meaning of life. Someone else, thanks for pointing that out, philosopher means, when translated or sort of parsed out, lovers of thought or lover of thought. So yeah, so let's actually begin with a blessing, since all study is sacred, but particularly Jewish study is especially, like, we want to set it apart. We want to acknowledge the holiness of what we're doing. If you're not Jewish, that's totally fine. All learning is sacred, regardless of who you are and regardless of where you are or why you're doing it. But it's sort of part of Jewish tradition to acknowledge that we're moving into something study-wise. So the blessing I'll say is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, King of the universe, who makes it possible, this is a loose translation, who makes it possible for us to be instructed, who makes it possible for us to receive Torah, to receive instruction, to receive knowledge. Still getting some good messages. Studied philosophy via theology courses, grad student. So yeah, so great to have everyone here tonight. So if you will turn to your PDF, we'll get started first of all by defining, what the heck I'm talking about when I say the word philosophy. Because I think, like theology, it can mean different things to different people, and there is an accepted definition sort of academically, and that's the definition that I want to use tonight, so that we're all on the same page. So the definition that I actually pulled from Merriam-Webster's dictionary is two parts. The first part is philosophy is the study of ideas about knowledge, truth, the nature and meaning of life, etc. So that's just ideas being parsed out, being debated, different frameworks or theories about how the world works, about what is true, about what it means to be a human being. And that's all very theoretical. The second half of the definition, as you can see in your handout, is is a bit more personal. It's a bit more pragmatic, and that is a set of ideas about how to do something or how to live. And so that cuts a little more closely, I think, to how when I say, my philosophy about something is fill in the blank, I'm speaking a bit more about the way that I sort of see the world versus something more academic. The two may cross over, and they frequently do, particularly if, like me, you studied philosophy in college. But I do want to make the distinction between like an academic definition and like a personal definition. So broadly, if philosophy is those two things, then what is Jewish philosophy? And this is really simple. Jewish philosophy is those things, but for Jews or about Jews or using the symbolism of Jews. The history, the culture, the symbolism, the traditions, the rituals of Jews put in a philosophical context, or trying to explain what it is to be a Jew, what Judaism is, using the methods and tools of philosophy as found in the secular world. What's interesting about Jewish philosophy, well, there's a lot of things, but particularly what's interesting about Jewish philosophy compared to other religious philosophical traditions like Christian philosophy or Muslim philosophy or other Buddhist philosophy. What's distinct about Jewish philosophy is, according to there's a text I read by Eugene Borowitz, who's a Reform rabbi, who essentially argues that Jews came to the philosophy of religion game late. Christianity had been doing the religious philosophy thing for a while. Islam had been doing the religious philosophy thing for a while. But most Jewish philosophers, up until a certain point in time, were generally Jews sort of accidentally. They were Jews who weren't necessarily religious Jews, and the philosophy they were doing wasn't necessarily Jewish philosophy. They just happened to be culturally or ethnically Jewish, or even religiously Jewish, but their philosophy didn't necessarily intersect with their religious practice. It wasn't until much more recently, in Europe, actually, that Jews began to embrace philosophy as a way of explaining and breaking down and wrestling with and redefining Judaism and the Jewish religion, what it means to be a Jew. So that's sort of unusual. One of the major catalysts for that shift, there were several. The first was the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, which happened in Europe, as I said, and the rise of like Reform Judaism, or what is sort of the equivalent of what is now Reform Judaism. It wasn't quite that organized at the time. But Jewish philosophy came about partially as a result of this rise in intellectualism among Jews, who were throwing themselves into secular society and were being very successful as Jews, who didn't want to lose their Jewishness and were trying to find ways to reconcile what they knew of the secular world with what they knew of Judaism. And sort of that's one of the frameworks. That's one of the catalysts for the development of Jewish philosophy, Jewish religious philosophy. Someone just said they left the shtetl. Yeah, they did. They left the shtetl. So for those of you who don't know the word shtetl is like an isolated community. They were very common in parts of Eastern Europe, where Jews and basically only Jews lived. If you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, it's a sort of an interesting illustration of what the shtetl might have looked like. Anyway, so the other catalyst, or the second catalyst, was the advent of the Holocaust, which took over 6 million Jewish lives, may their memories be for a blessing, and left the survivors and those of us who came after the survivors, those of us who are descended from survivors, those of us who are, or in my case, converts who are taking this story onto themselves, or taking this legacy onto themselves, it changed the way that Jews wanted to think about their religion and their identity. It changed the way Jews think about themselves. And so the reason why I wanted to focus on specifically Jewish philosophy after the Holocaust versus Jewish philosophy after the Haskalah, after the Enlightenment, the Jewish Enlightenment, is because I think the change after the Holocaust has been more dramatic, and I think we see more of it now than perhaps what we would have seen, the changes that came about as a result of the Haskalah, as a result of the Jewish Enlightenment. I think that we feel the changes in the way that we think about the world and the way that we do Judaism without always realizing that those changes came about as a result of the Holocaust. So that's what we'll be looking at tonight. So in order to do that, I mean, the reality is this is a little bit complicated. Philosophy is a dense subject, and I don't want anyone to be overboard by simply quoting things at you and assuming that you will keep up and that you would even want to keep up. And so one of the things that I was inspired to do is inspired by the Passover Seder. For those of you who don't know, the Passover Seder is a meal that we have sometimes more than once during the festival of Passover, which happens in the spring. It tends to coincide, well, it coincides with the Christian season of Easter. And the purpose of Passover is to celebrate the mythic leaving Egypt by the ancient Hebrews led by Moses. And the Passover Seder was designed to be a dramatization. It's a meal and it's a play that we participate in every year when we study and when we celebrate the Exodus. And the rabbis in ancient Judaism and traditional Judaism, in creating the idea of a Passover Seder, wanted to have certain guidelines to fuel conversation. Because the question came, well, what do we do at this Seder? Other than dramatize, the Passover, the Exodus, what's the point? Well, the point is to ask questions and to generate conversation brought up by hearing the story of the Passover. So the question is inevitably asked by the rabbis. Well, what sorts of questions should we ask? And the response was, well, you should really think of your own. Everyone should come prepared to ask questions. But in reality, you might not necessarily have any in mind when you come in. If so, here are some questions to think about. And eventually, these questions, and there are 4 of them, and if you've been to a Passover Seder, I'm sure you'll recognize those 4 questions. Those 4 questions became the norm. And people sort of stopped thinking of their own questions in some cases and just started deferring to these 4. So tonight, to simplify things, because especially for those of you who've never looked at a philosophy textbook before or never studied philosophy and are either intimidated or not sure how interested you are, I want to make this as simple as possible and as non-scary as possible because it's, for me, a very fun subject. I decided to ask 4 questions of my own. My 4 questions are designed to look at what I think are 4 key points that each major philosopher after the Holocaust has had to answer in some way, and they don't all answer them the same, obviously, in some way after the Holocaust to better understand Judaism today. And how these philosophers differ in their answers will give you a very simplified overview, and I really emphasize those words, very simplified overview of where these philosophers stand in terms of major Jewish trends in thinking since the Holocaust. So the first question we'll look at is there a God? Pretty straightforward, maybe. Is there a God? Why do human beings suffer? That's the second question. How should we live? And what does it mean to be a Jew? So again, is there a God? Why do human beings suffer? How should we live? And what does it mean to be a Jew? So those are the questions that we're going to look at tonight. And we're going to look at 3 different philosophers. We're going to look at 1 philosopher tonight, and 2 more next week, because I wanted to spend a little time acclimating everyone, answering any questions that might arise, that sort of thing. So we're going to look at 3 different philosophers, 1 tonight, 2 next week, and these are 3 thinkers that I feel like defined very clear trends in Jewish thinking, and I'll try to title those trends for you just so it's easier to kind of pick them out. So that isn't to say, however, that these are the only 3 Jewish philosophers that were doing work after the Holocaust, and God knows that as I was looking through all of the different titles that I could explore for putting this presentation together, there were so many philosophers who've been enormously instrumental in defining Judaism philosophically for Jews today. But I feel like these 3, I picked them maybe at random. I don't think it's random. I think there's a logic to it. But you may feel that someone else is more important. If so, that's okay. And I encourage you to share anything that you have with you in the comments, other philosophers you might recommend. So the first philosopher, the philosopher we're going to look at tonight, is Abraham Joshua Heschel, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And if you are following along on your PDF, you'll actually see a picture of him on the far right of the photograph. On the far left of the photograph is Martin Luther King Jr. In the middle of the photograph, I believe, is Rabbi Eisendrath, Maurice Eisendrath. I'm hesitant to say that because I'm afraid that I'm going to be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath, who was an influential Reform rabbi at the time. But that was during one of the civil rights marches, and Heschel frequently participated in civil rights causes in the 60s. So before I go any further and give us a little biography of Heschel, what I'd like from you is to, if there's anything that you know about Heschel in advance or anything about Heschel you find particularly inspiring, share that in the chat room. Or if there are questions that you would like me to answer about Heschel, I will do my best. If I don't have the answer, I will let you know where to go. Okay. So while you're doing that, Heschel is the author of a number of books on Jewish philosophy. He's now deceased. May his memory be for a blessing. The book that I referred to most in putting this presentation together is a book called God in Search of Man, which I actually have right here. This is what the title looks like, if you can see that well enough. God in Search of Man, the subtitle is A Philosophy of Judaism. Heschel also put together a much shorter book, and this one isn't too thick, isn't too bad, but it's a little bit larger. It's one of his larger works. He also put together another book on the sort of the ideas behind the Jewish Sabbath, why we celebrate the Sabbath, what the Sabbath means to the Jewish people. And it's, of course, titled The Sabbath. Surprise, surprise. And it's a much, much shorter book. I think it's only 40 or 50 pages. And I also looked through some of the Sabbath, or revisited some of the Sabbath to kind of reorient myself to Heschel. He also wrote a book called The Prophets that I highly recommend that is, surprise, surprise, about the prophets. So Heschel was Polish. He immigrated to the United States, and he was a professor of philosophy. He also taught mysticism and practical rabbinics. Heschel is unique among the philosophers that we're looking at because all 3 of them are rabbis, but Heschel was actually ordained both as an Orthodox rabbi and as a liberal rabbi. He pursued both Orthodox and liberal ordination studies and completed both. And Heschel is extremely beloved, and of the, I would say, the most visible Jewish philosophers or Jewish scholars in recent years, Heschel is probably the most traditional. And we're going to look a little bit at what that means, how that defines his work. He taught for 5 years at the Hebrew Union College, which was the Reform Seminary, or is the Reform Seminary. And after 5 years, he resigned, where he switched over to the conservative seminary, the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he taught for many, many years. And again, because as you can see in the photograph, he did a lot of work with Martin Luther King. He's highly visible both within the Jewish world and outside the Jewish world. And a lot of his philosophy, for reasons that we'll try to explore a little bit tonight, a lot of his philosophy has appealed to non-Jews as well. particularly Christians. I find a lot of Christian groups who study the Jewish roots of Christianity often find something to love in Heschel. So, okay, so I think we're good to go on that. Looking to see, I don't see anyone having responded to the question about Heschel. That's totally fine. If you have any questions at any point, or you want to jump in, feel free to do so. Okay, so Heschel represents the first of three viewpoints that we'll be looking at, and that is what I call the activist mystic perspective. This is a viewpoint that is very popular, ironically, sort of, among liberal Jews, despite the fact that Heschel, I think, was more comfortable in traditional circles than he was in conservative or liberal circles. And yet, Heschel has sort of come to embody this idea of the activist mystic. And so we'll look at a little bit about what that means. So the first question is there a God? Let's get out of the way right now. Yes, Heschel believes there is a God, but it's more of a yes but or a yes and situation than it is yes or no. For one thing, this is because Heschel's definition of God is hard to pin down. Heschel is an intellectual, professor of philosophy, and he wants to acknowledge that religion sometimes forces people to believe or claim to believe things that might not necessarily be provable. And he finds that distasteful. So he wants to, a lot of Heschel's work, he avoids giving like a 1 or 2 sentence definition of God, which makes it very hard for me to tell you, well, Heschel believed this about God. Lanny just jumped in and said, who can pin down a definition of God? I think that's a fair point. What's interesting about a lot of contemporary Jewish philosophy is that in light of the Holocaust and in light of the enormous suffering that Jews have undergone, trying to figure out what God looks like or what God is, or if there is even a God, becomes really important. And so Heschel is all for Heschel is definitely in the yes, there's a God camp. However, Heschel wants to avoid defining God too clearly, and part of that is because he resists religious dogma. He actually opens God in Search of Man with this interesting little anecdote about how he feels one of the reasons why modern people, not just Jews, but anyone, if you consider yourself a modern person, if you're in the product of a modern age, Heschel believes one of the reasons why you are more likely to resist being religious and will instead choose to be secular, or might describe yourself as spiritual but not religious, is because religion hasn't done a very good job endearing himself, or rather, religion hasn't done a very good job endearing itself to the individual. Religion has been the source of a number of injustices against human beings, including anti-Semitism, which is something that Heschel seems to acknowledge, that religious thinking can lead to hatred of other human beings. So Heschel is very resistant to say that religion is always a good thing. And he has pretty harsh words at the beginning of God in Search of Man for certain kinds of religion, and essentially says, if people choose not to be religious, it is in part because you have scared them away. The word he uses is, or one of the words he uses is insipid. You are promoting this sort of dumb way of thinking, this dangerous way of thinking, and people don't want it, so they don't embrace religion. This is characteristic, this idea of describing God without ever defining God is characteristic of a lot of mystic thinkers within Judaism, and Heschel is among the most visible. He wants to say that there is a natural world, the world that we live in, that can be seen and touched and tasted and smelt and sensed in all of the ways, perceived in all of the ways we perceive the natural world. And God is whatever exists outside of that. Other philosophers would say, well, we need to establish that there is something outside of that. We also need to establish that our senses are reliable, that what we're perceiving is trustworthy, that essentially our sensory inputs are not deceiving us in some way, and that beyond that, there would even be something more than the natural world. But Heschel begins with the premise that yes, there's something out of the natural world or outside of what exists, and that thing outside of everything that exists is God. Heschel, the metaphor that I want to use, or the image that I want to use, is, I don't know if you've ever seen a movie where scientists are using those, like a glass shield and plastic gloves to handle nuclear material. That's essentially the image that I think best works with the picture of God that Heschel has. God, that is to say, God rarely interacts with our world in a physical, experiential way, in a way that we can sort of say, I had an encounter with God, according to Heschel, but he does do it. Most of it, though, or mostly though, he just kind of exists outside of our world. So we can't pin him down, we can't clearly define him, and we instead, and Heschel does this pretty frequently, resort to descriptors like transcendent, omniscient, all-powerful, these very sort of existential, the sort of ultimate terms. God is sort of the ultimate thing behind all things. In fact, the quote that I pulled out for this, this is on page 91 of God in Search of Man, if you need the reference or would like the reference. The quote is, "The biblical mind is deeply aware that the ultimate, God, is beyond the given. What is given, so what we experience, the natural world, all of that, is not ultimate. What is given is not ultimate, but is created by him who is not given." And that's something that Heschel is going to come back to. This is something that I just kind of want to get out of the way. Heschel doesn't really make much of an argument for the existence of God. He doesn't do apologetics. He just sort of starts with the assumption there is a God, lays down some descriptions, and then goes from there. And what's interesting is that even though God is central to Heschel's project, his way of looking at the world, even though that's the case, he doesn't want to. He wants to kind of give God room to breathe. If there is a God, I don't want to assume I understand what that God looks like. I don't want to assume that I understand everything about that God. There are some basic qualities he assigns to God, like ultimate goodness, ultimate kindness, ultimate compassion. Heschel's God is conscious. That's something that's important to note, that other philosophers within Judaism have tried to move toward more of a naturalistic, sort of God is our experience of the natural world, and there isn't anything beyond that. Heschel avoids that entirely. In fact, he uses a quote from the book of Ecclesiastes that says, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity under the sun." And his argument there is, well, if the God of Judaism was simply a product of, or the sum total of, our experience of the natural world, or the natural world itself, if all I'm doing when I pray to God is worshiping nature, or experiencing gratitude for my reality as I see it, as I perceive it, then how come the writer of the text of Ecclesiastes says that everything under the sun, everything in the natural world, is vain and meaningless? No, if Ecclesiastes says that everything in the natural world is ultimately temporary and doesn't have ultimate meaning, then there has to be something else that has ultimate meaning, and that's the thing we call God. So that's sort of Heschel's take on God. I wanted to take a look at a couple of responses. Jewish religion brought the concept of absolute right and wrong. Someone mentions deism, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next week, at least in part. Okay, so moving from that, so is there a God? Yes, but, or yes, and. moving on to why do human beings suffer? So one of the things that Heschel wants to avoid is he wants to avoid saying that evil is what happens when people aren't religious. In fact, he makes it very clear that religion can perpetuate evil. In fact, that's one of his initial premises: is why would you want to be religious when religion can perpetuate injustice? So he avoids this mistake, or this potential mistake, of saying religious people are all good people. If you aren't religious, you're a bad person. And if you are a religious person who hurts someone, well, then you were never religious to begin with. He avoids that sort of no true Scotsman, the logical fallacy of like, well, you don't really belong to us because you made us look bad or whatever. This sort of no true Scotsman fallacy. He avoids that. However, at the same time, he sort of wants to have his cake and eat it too. This is where my interpretation comes in. On the one hand, he wants to say that religion doesn't necessarily mean that evil doesn't happen. In fact, he uses the prophets as an excellent example of a moment or moments throughout history when it has been necessary for people to speak up against injustices perpetuated by religion, because in part that's what the philosophers, or that's what the prophets in ancient Judaism, in sort of temple era Judaism, that's part of what they were doing. They wanted to say that just because we have this religion, just because we have this temple cult, doesn't mean that we're good people and there's something missing here. So he wants to avoid saying religion makes you good, but at the same time, he does believe that evil comes as a result of making choices that are in disobedience to God. This is a classical Jewish viewpoint, and this is something about Heschel that makes him both interesting for some people and frustrating for others, that he is in essence affirming more of a traditional worldview, at least in part, that there is a right and there is a wrong, but they're not so much qualities or substances, rather, as they are descriptors that we use to describe choices that we make. And we judge those choices based on the impact that they have on ourselves, on others. And he also wants to go farther than that and say that choices that have negative impact, what he would describe as evil, comes as a direct result of disobeying God. So whatever the right thing to do is in any given situation, that is what obedience to God looks like in that moment. And you don't necessarily need religion to tell you that. You don't necessarily need religion to affirm that for you, at least not according to Heschel. So he wants to, part of this too is that he wants to avoid giving God credit for creating evil. If God created, this is sort of the classic question, if God created, if God created good, then God must have created evil. If God created everything in the universe, then God created the healthy things and the unhealthy things. God created the productive things and the unproductive things. So why is it that, if we have the tree in the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve are told not to eat from it, why didn't he just take the tree away? If God knew that it was going to be the cause of pain and suffering and cause, essentially, at least according to the biblical view, cause the suffering that it caused. And so Heschel wants to say, well, God didn't create evil. All God did, essentially, was give us a set of instructions, a set of both ethical and ritual commandments that we're supposed to follow. And if we don't do those things, that's where evil comes from. Evil doesn't come from God. Evil comes from the fact that everything has an opposite. Although apparently God doesn't have an opposite. That's something that Heschel, he avoids saying that God has an opposite in something like the Christian concept of Satan, for example. So God created our world with all of its complexity and both its capacity for good and evil without directly creating evil. For example, there's a quote from page 376 of God in Search of Man where he says, "To the Jewish mind, evil is an instrument rather than an iron wall, a temptation, an occasion rather than an ultimate power." So he's not talking about a force. He's not talking about demons. He's not talking about the devil or whatever. He's talking about the opposite of whatever good things God has given to us. And he actually points to a bit that we recite when we recite the Shema. If we recite the full text of the Shema, there's a bit at the end, see, I have placed before you life and death, choose life that you might live. And Heschel sort of refers to that and says, well, see, that's an example of God laying down what's best for us. And whatever the opposite of that is, whatever that absence is, that's where evil has the occasion to occur. And so things like the Holocaust, even, I think Heschel would argue, are injustices perpetuated as a result of failing to see the basic human dignity of all persons, and affirming the dignity of all persons is something that that would be within God's sort of will. That would be affirming the dignity of all persons would be within God's sort of obeying God or being obedient to God. I want to see what someone asked. Would Heschel then view good and evil as entirely predicated on a declaration from God? That is to say, good and evil are only make sense in light of a divine injunction, nothing outside of the legal injunction. I think Heschel would argue that I'm assuming by legal here you mean like the laws of the land, like the laws of a particular country. I think Heschel would argue that it's the goal of lawmakers to create laws to reflect whatever God's law would be. And to answer the first half of your question, that good and evil are entirely predicated on a decision made by God, yes. Yeah, Heschel is saying that whatever God says is good, whatever God says is evil. He fixes sort of the danger of that, because you could easily say, well, then God says commit genocide, and in fact there are passages in the Torah that advocate genocide, and Heschel would not advocate for genocide. So how does he get out of that? Well, he first of all gets out of that by not taking the Torah literally, which is sort of the big trump card, right? Like with any contemporary Jewish philosopher or any theologian in any religion that describes themselves as more progressive, they would say, oh, well, I don't take it literally. So Heschel wants to say we don't necessarily take every piece of the Torah literally. And he would also say that, that God embodies certain qualities that we experience as good, and that our experience bears out the goodness of God's decisions, versus God tells me to do something, I believe that God tells me to do something, and it's something that everyone else would believe is horrible, but I have to do it because whatever. Heschel sort of avoids saying God would force people to do something we would consider to be vile, because God embodies qualities that we consider to be positive qualities. God happens to be reflected in those qualities. And when we experience those qualities, Heschel, I think, would say we're essentially bumping elbows with God. We're sort of rubbing up against God in a sort of obtuse way, rather than experiencing God directly. He also, and this is before we move on to the next question, at the end of days, evil will be conquered by the one. In historic times, evils must be conquered one by one. So he's sort of acknowledging there that evil is a reality in the world that God made. Which leads me into the third question: how should we live? Heschel's solution to the problem of suffering isn't so much to look at, where does evil come from? I mean, he offers an explanation, like I said before, but this is where the activist part of the activist mystic title comes from. The way we should live is to pursue justice, which is also obedience to God. That's not ritual obedience to God in the Orthodox religion sense, which Heschel, interestingly enough, also believes is important, at least for Jews, but that there are certain ethical truths which Heschel believes are universal, and he believes they're universal because we experience them as positive universally. He doesn't really offer necessarily, that I can find, any proof for why we experience these qualities universally, or even if we do experience these qualities universally. But that's his premise. And if you take his premise as true, then any person, Jew or non-Jew, has a goal to be obedient to God, whether they realize it or not, by acting ethically. This leads into the sort of activist mystic category of thinking, which I'll define sort of. This is the way that I choose to define this. If you have a different definition or you've heard this term somewhere else, feel free to refer to that. But the activist mystic believes in God as a transcendent, real, yet utterly irrational being. Irrational in the sense that we can't perceive God or measure God scientifically because God exists outside of the natural and therefore scientifically measurable world. Um, the activist mystic sees good and evil as the categories we use to describe our choices, and believes the appropriate response to the God, the transcendent sort of mystic God, is through obedience to certain strictures, laws, values, so that we always choose life as the passage from the Shema says versus death. Lanny mentions, "Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God." I think that's a fantastic quote from I believe the Book of Micah. Lanny, if I'm wrong about that, feel free to say so in the comments. I don't want to misquote. So then, lastly, and then I'll kind of summarize. Lastly, what does it mean to be a Jew? This question is maybe less interesting to someone who isn't Jewish, but from an interfaith perspective, it can be a really interesting kind of window into one of the leading Jewish philosophers. So Jews are, Heschel believes, witnesses to and sort of pointers out to moments of when God, this transcendent mystical God, tells us right and tells us wrong, and we choose right. So as Jews, we are essentially experiencing, the central story of the Torah is this idea of being freed from slavery and then being given autonomy, given laws and precepts, and sort of told how to live and then set free to do that, and also set free to make mistakes. Heschel sees, even if you don't take the story literally, Heschel sees our job as Jews is to be witnesses to the central ethical teaching of that story, which is the pursuit of what he interprets as the pursuit of justice, the pursuit of right versus wrong, which is, I think, one of the reasons why he was so inspired to involve himself in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. But it also goes further than that, and this is one of the pretty significant areas that Heschel diverges from other Jewish philosophers. Heschel believes that it is the responsibility of Jews, traditional, liberal, whatever, to keep Jewish law. And when I say Jewish law, there's a certain set of customs and traditions commonly laid out in, if you're Orthodox, like the Shulchan Aruch, or if you're conservative, a guide to religious practice, or if you're Reform, like Living Judaism, these texts that sort of break down what our customs and traditions are. Heschel believes it is the job of Jews to keep tradition. That means keeping kosher. That means praying 3 times a day. That means, devoutly attending Shabbat services and lighting Shabbos candles and fasting on the holidays and all of that stuff. Because in his mind, that's all almost dramatizing the way in which we bear witness to these ethical teachings. And in his mind, those traditions are still binding. This is actually something that really put him at odds with other liberal Jewish philosophers in his day, so much so that I believe Rabbi Jonah Rank, who is, if I'm not mistaken, who is a conservative rabbi, to actually write a piece that you can find online about Heschel and how, despite the fact that he was, a liberal rabbi, in name and working in liberal Jewish circles, was basically, sort of a liberal Orthodox Jew. He was very, very traditional. And this put him at odds with a lot of other rabbis and philosophers, including 2 that we'll look at next week, because he wanted to emphasize the importance of keeping those traditional laws. For example, this is interesting actually, this was kind of a humorous anecdote, but in 1953 he gave an address to the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the Reform kind of rabbinic association, professionals association. And the title of the address was "Towards an Understanding of Halakha." Halakha is a Hebrew word that refers to Jewish law, the stuff that I was talking about before. And in this address, he basically takes Reform rabbis to task for not being traditional enough and not keeping those traditions. And the reaction to it was obviously very dubious. The reform movement has a very different perspective on, and we'll actually look at one reform rabbi next week. Very different perspective on what the responsibility of Jews are in terms of keeping tradition and whether or not it's necessary to keep certain traditions, keep kosher or whatever. Obviously it put him at odds with reform leadership. But one anecdote that I found, and I was unable to verify this with a second source, so I quote it sort of dubiously, but one anecdote that I found said that in responses that he received, letters that he received in response to his speech towards an understanding of halakha, in which he advocated for more traditional Judaism, the letters would start off with, "I can't believe you just said," or, clearly, Rabbi, you don't understand Reform Judaism or liberal Judaism or whatever, but would always end with, "But we respect you enormously." I mean, he had a very interesting relationship with liberal Judaism. He always seemed right, to the right, traditionally on the spectrum of his colleagues in the liberal Jewish world, including in conservative Judaism at times. And yet he identified with what I think has been characteristic of a lot of liberal Judaism, which is this push toward social justice and this push toward emphasizing ethical teachings as well. Heschel is certainly not advocating that Jews must keep Jewish law to the exclusion of their passions or to the exclusion of their, he wants to balance both love for Judaism in all of its many parts, but also love of keeping Judaism and love of not just Jewish ideas, but Jewish traditions, Jewish law. So that was something, characteristic of his mysticism. He sought this kind of marriage of emotional fervor with adherence to the law, with legal adherence. And so that was Heschel. So let me just real quick go over the 4 points just in one sentence or two, just for reference. And then I'm going to log out here. But I want to stay on for a couple minutes to answer any questions you might have in the chat room. Let me say in conclusion, before I review the 4 questions, that, again, thank you for coming out. Thank you for coming out to OneShul. Thank you for getting involved. If you can make a donation, even the price of a cup of coffee helps to sustain us, helps us to keep broadcasting each month, and keep doing services, and keep publishing things that you like to read, and connecting people to different kinds of Judaism. If not, no worries. Thank you for coming out, and you're more than welcome to come back next week, which will be Monday at 7 o'clock, and we'll wrap this up. And so thank you for everything. Let me review these 4 questions, and then I will say goodnight. So first of all, is there a God? Yes, but he can't necessarily be pinned down, and he exists outside of nature. Why do human beings suffer? Because we have essentially been given the right way to live, and everything has an opposite. So the not right way to live is something we have the free will to choose, and that is disobedience to God, and it causes pain. Both our pain and the pain of other people. How should we live? By pursuing justice. Again, this activist mystic way of thinking. And what does it mean to be a Jew? We should achieve emotional fervor in our Judaism, but also maintain traditional adherence to the law when possible. So that was Heschel, at least in brief. Again, partially an interpretation, also partially an oversimplification. I encourage you to do more reading. I've cited some sources in your PDF. Feel free to look at that or Google. Heschel is an amazing rabbi, and even though I don't agree with all of his points, I'm happy to have been able to share him with you. So I'll be in the comments section for a few more minutes to answer questions. And thanks so much. Have a great night, and shalom.